exchange of views. Mr. van der Hoeven, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair and Ambassador. And I have to thank you because you made a lot of remarks which are usually in the brief of the moderator to be short, etc. So I can immediately go into, I think, following up of your interesting some introductions for our panel, and then to see how we could forward to move very much how we can come to a collective view and viewpoint on trying to combat the COVID pandemic and the consequences thereof. The effects of the COVID have been immense. The pandemic, as you mentioned, also has caused massive loss in working hours, threatening people's livelihoods, etc. And we noticed that fragmented social protection measures, inefficient delivery system, and inadequate attention to gender responsiveness impeded protecting people from where they need it the most. Important is the school closures, which have threatened to deepen inequality in access to education, but also threatening future economic and social development and leading to greater inequalities between socioeconomic groups within countries. Very important at the moment. Member states, though, took swift action and unprecedented measures. For example, many countries leveraged economic measures to support sectors and individuals hit by the crisis. Institution of tax relief, VAT exemptions, and debt relief programs, etc. But richer countries were better able to take economic support and economic stimulus measures than least developed and economic countries, many of which did not have access to necessary vaccines on top of that. Both issues threatened very much a fully global economic and social recovery. And I hope in this panel that we can lead the international community to solutions to that. We have seen that social protection measures have expanded massively since the onset of COVID, and almost 20% of global stimulus packages were spent on social protection measures. Countries responded to protect household food security through in-kind of vouchers and school feeding programs. Also, cash transfers were often applied. And also interesting to know that most cash transfer schemes are new schemes, not existing schemes. And also existing social programs were expanded. Vertically, benefits to existing beneficiaries more, and horizontally, coverage of existing programs to new beneficiaries. Also, in many countries where they exist, unemployment insurance schemes have provided significant and rapid response. Countries also leverage digital technologies to deal with these issues and labor markets. So, now the pandemic seems to be receding. An important question is whether these new programs will lead to permanent better social security systems, because often they were emergency systems, and will they also be able to expeditiously turn the nefast trend of increasing poverty, which is so much documented in the other UN meetings, and the growing inequality within countries, which can actually counteract development and social development. And so the panel, as a panel, aim to discuss how national policy measures and helping to combat poverty and hunger, and to stay on track with SDG 1 and SDG 3, especially examine lessons how these national policies and measures tackle poverty and food insecurity, explore further mechanisms for sharing successful policies, and also explore how the Commission could continue to enhance its role in empowering people, promoting inclusive and equitable recovery, and contributing to a more inclusive, resilient society and sustainable development globally, not only nationally, but globally, as you indicated also. After these few words, I'd like to give the floor to His Excellency Marisol Merkel. And I don't need to remind you of the wise words our chair has said about the time limits, and I will also use my power of the chair to let you know if we are closing to the time limit. And remember, you will get time again to come back in the panel. Your presentation is not only the only time you're here on the panel, so you can always use other arguments in a second round. Mrs. Merkel, you have the floor. Can you unmute?
Bueno,
Yeah.
muy buenos días nuevamente, ahora sí, en forma oficial. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much.
por permitirnos este enfoque, esta participación,
I'm afraid that the speaker's sound is not very good. It's very hard for the interpreter to hear.
Mrs. Merkel?
Interpretation will be suspended until the sound improves,
Mrs.
regretfully.
Merkel, can I just interrupt? Mrs. Merkel?
¿Se escucha bien?
Mrs. Merkel? I just get a message from the interpreters that they're worried about the interpretation because of the sound quality. So I look at technical group of the UN. Will the speech only then be heard in Spanish?
Anthony, could you just, it would be really important, could you just once more please see with the President Merkel, if she could, if you manage with the microphone, we would really like to listen in all 6 languages.
Hi, Claudia. Sure.
Si les parece, podemos por ahí pasar a un segundo moderador mientras tratamos de acomodar el sistema de sonido, ¿les parece? Así no nos detenemos.
The second speaker while efforts are being made to improve the sound system.
Hi. So Claudia, if you can relay to her, so yeah, it's hard to hear. It's not just the low volume, high frequencies are pretty much gone. Might her microphone, if it's a flat microphone from a conferencing system, could it possibly be covered with papers somewhere? We make sure that the microphone is visible.
Thank you, Anthony. I asked the interpreters also for their help here. Presidenta Merkel, Marisol, we very much appreciate that you try to solve the technical issues. So with your permission and the moderator, we would go to the next speaker. And what my colleague said, the technician said, is that there is like an echo, or you seem to be very far away. Maybe because it's a telephone conference setup, because we would really like to hear your presentation in all 6 languages. We would very graciously, I think, take your offer and go to the next speaker and have your technician work in the background on this. If this is also fine with your time.
Mrs. Marisol is muted at the moment. Miss. And the chair is asking for the floor.
Sí, muchísimas gracias. Mire, Claudia, ya nos hemos contactado también con la señora Merkel, como ella propuso.
Claudia, we've managed to contact Madam Merkel as was proposed. We can move on to the second panelist. Madam Merkel will try to connect directly with a computer in order to avoid the issues with the microphone. So thank you very much. And perhaps we can continue, Mr. Moderator, with the next panelist.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chair. I'd like now to call on Stefan Craney, Ambassador and Vice Director of the Federal Social Insurance System in Switzerland. Mr. Craney, you have the floor.
Yes. Madame la Présidente, Monsieur le Modérateur, chers panélistes, Mesdames et Messieurs, je
Madam
m'exprime.
Chair, distinguished moderator, ladies and gentlemen, I am here to speak about a very decentralized country. Our social security system is one and whole for the entire country, and my ministry is largely responsible for the system. However, most of our social policy is implemented regionally or locally, and today I would like to share with you about some of our specific policies. I will be speaking about poverty and the threat of poverty in Switzerland. I will be speaking about people who do not request social services and the participation of people living in poverty in policies that affect them. So first, poverty and the risk of poverty in Switzerland. In many countries, being poor does not necessarily mean not having a roof over your head or not being able to support your family. In Switzerland, you are considered to be living in poverty when you do not make enough to support your family, to pay for health insurance, to have decent housing, or pay for a dentist visit. In Switzerland, poverty is particularly serious in single-family households or in people with a low level of education who are unable to find a new job after losing their job. But many people are also threatened with poverty or living with the risk of poverty. These are people who have lower income than the rest of the population. Those who have this risk are often in single-parent households, and this is more common also among people with a lower level of education. Being at the risk of poverty means that you are at the mercy of whether you lose your job, whether you have a serious health problem, or lose your housing situation. This means that your social integration may be threatened, and being poor does not necessarily mean that you do not have a job. You can be poor while working part-time, being self-employed, having a fixed-term contract, or working in a small business. It's very common in Switzerland to work part-time, especially among women. Thus, it is possible to be living in poverty even though you are pursuing some form of employment. Our social protection system played a big role during the pandemic. It prevented people in vulnerable groups from drifting into poverty. But we need to continue our efforts. We have to follow the experiences of people threatened with poverty. In Switzerland, researchers are working on this issue, and we're also supporting international efforts to provide data, especially with respect to loss of housing. There are certain events that can weaken social protection, and one of these issues is lack of access to social services. This brings me to my next point. It's very important to ensure that the population has social protections and to provide social services. But the question is, why do some people not turn to the social services to which they have the right? This is a phenomenon that has been covered by the OECD, the EU, but less than fraud. However, lack of access is important and a big issue. It's a very complicated issue. It has to do with the specific person, of course, their situation, their origin, their social cultural background, but also with how our social policy is implemented and developed. We have to ask people affected by this phenomenon about their experience because it is key. We can learn from them that they may feel embarrassed about requesting services. They may feel confused by bureaucratic requirements, or they might be afraid of not being respected. And we can see that lack of access manifests itself differently among men and women. This is a paradox. We have created a system that to integrate people, but actually it leads to them being excluded. And because it is so complex, of course, there are solutions. Scientists are looking for various paths. For example, we need to have better documentation of this phenomenon. We need to have more training, simplify administrative procedures, take into account the desire of women to be empowered. And this leads me to my third point, which is involving people in decision-making, actually policy related to poverty. Now, this kind of participation-based approach is very demanding of us, but it does produce positive results. It can help us assess needs and improve the effectiveness of our policies, especially for people who are affected by poverty. They were participating in our national anti-poverty program, which covers a period from 2019 to 2024 and really focuses on involving people affected by poverty. We still have much left to do. According to an assessment, few projects have been implemented within our public social services, and we also need to do more to develop political and legal foundations. Nevertheless, a 2020 study has provided some specific recommendations for stakeholders as well as recommendations for a promising approach. The relevant institutions in Switzerland will be able to support participatory projects and use a participation-based approach. In conclusion, in countries such as Switzerland, living in the threat of poverty, not knowing your rights, not making a request for social services, and feeling excluded are some of the personal experiences of our population. But among political decision makers, we are realizing that we need to move forward more and to take into account the voice of these people so that we can have more effective social policies and make a difference. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Craney, for this concise statement. Your emphasis on participatory action in programs, I think, is very important, especially also in developed countries, where one often thinks there's no poverty anymore and people feel themselves excluded. So I think we like to learn also something from the experiences in your country. I'm just asking my technician now whether Mrs. Merkel has been able to set up her connection. Otherwise, I give the floor to Mrs. Muguni Muto. As our third speaker on the list, Mr. Mohammed Kunin has not yet arrived yet. So with much further ado, I like to ask Mrs. Muguni Muto, Vice President of the Japan International Cooperation Agencies, to make her statement and observations. Mrs. Muto, you have the floor.
A ver, disculpen, ¿ahí se escucha bien?
Well, now.
Excuse me, who? This is Mrs. Marisol. Do you want to, have you tested the interpretation quality so that we can continue, not continue, but start with your statement? It's
Bien, bien. Bueno, ahora sí, les pido disculpas y bueno, qué bueno.
Yes, I must apologize and see if it's possible to continue with the presentation. We're trying to resolve these problems. So once again, I should like to greet you and thank you very much for the invitation to this meeting. It's very important for us as a country to be able to share in this and in particular listen to what Stephen says and others. So we're very interested as well in following things up with Maria del Carmen Squiff, who is our ambassador, and this opportunity provides us to share with you the government policies and to show you what we're doing regarding the pandemic, which has affected everybody globally. I shall endeavor to be brief. In Argentina, for our president, for our country, planning and predictability are very important, not just during the course of this pandemic, but we need to look at our short-term policies, which have been implemented as emergency measures when the pandemic commenced. And our main focus is healthcare, to look after the economy as well, the welfare of Argentinian men and women. We want to look again at the productive fabric of our country. So it's a question of a coordination among social policies. And we have been working on this constantly with all of you, with the international organizations here in the United Nations. This is of great significance for us and for each of the government areas in Argentina, for each of the ministries working together in the 24 areas that we have in our country. I'd just like to share with you what I have prepared. You can look at page 1 here, where I shall show you the main four fundamental pillars that we looked at on page 1, given this pandemic with its socioeconomic and sociocultural effects. We wish to ensure continuity regarding our government policy, to extend our health network, to provide ongoing food assistance, to support the income of our men and women at work, both in the formal and informal sectors, and also to strengthen in the income in all our social protection sectors. Again, to provide help for all our citizens. May we move on to the next page, please. Now, here we have an idea of the way in which our country addressed the issues, looking at healthcare and all the tools that Argentina was able to use and get up and running in a very few months of 2020. So we consolidated our healthcare network. We had 12 modular emergency hospitals, 14 frontline health centers, 18 centers for responsible tourism, and we had more beds in our intensive care units. We provided respirators. There was an increase there. Now, we can move on to the next page, please, which showed what we did to provide greater food assistance. Because prior to the pandemic, our country was suffering from economic and social difficulties here. And one of the problems that we have is to ensure that there's a stable government policy to deal with those who are worst off. So we have a food card. We also had community dining rooms, school meals, and a significant increase in the budget for these, which continues today. And if we could have the next slide now. We supported the income of our men and women at work, again, both in the formal and informal sectors. We wish to sustain production and extend it, indeed, increase it in Argentina. And this pertains to each of the programs that we agreed upon and consolidated with the various ministries. We wanted to help every family, every undertaking, all the production units in our country to bring about stability on the labor market, stability of production throughout Argentina. And then the last and important point is to strengthen income levels. If we could move on to the next slide now. Again, thinking of our citizens coming under our social protection system. We have an extremely extensive database, and by means of our National Institute for Social Policies, we are able to look at our statistics and every day to coordinate with the bodies providing allocations for each of the projects that we have in our country. Now, perhaps we could move on to the next slide, which shows the extension of government policies for sustainable development. I referred to strengthening the emerging programs, but we have ongoing consolidation to provide a national impulse for what we believe to be fundamental. And we wish, obviously, to ensure coordination and planning throughout our country. If we can move on, please. In our National Council, we play a strategic role. We're an authoritative authoritative body dealing with the implementation of the SDGs and sustainable development. So we are constantly in communication with the interministerial coordinating committees and the various ministries involved in order to implement the SDGs. We have a federal approach with technical aid for provincial and local governments, and again, at a national level. We also communicate always internationally, and we wish to implement those projects and proposals which provide us with tools for us to continue our development and to move towards the achievement of the SDGs. We have very significant coordination with private companies, private undertakings, and obviously with civil society. If I could have the next slide, please. We are constantly aware of the challenges facing us in our management as we move towards the full implementation of the SDGs. We wish to involve all involved in policy in our country, looking at the 2030 agenda. Obviously, we want to affect the poverty rate
Ms.
and that of
Merkel,
hunger.
would you like to, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but would you like to wind off? And as I indicated, there's always a possibility to come back in a second round. Thank you very much.
Perfecto. Bueno, quiero agradecerles y somos un organismo que está a disposición y en articulación.
And say that my body is always available, and we are constantly thinking of the ways in which we can strengthen our country and share those means. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I didn't intend to stop you immediately. I wanted to give you a few words, but I think you have given us a very concise message, first by indicating how to target the worst office budget increase, then to also indicate the different ways of targeting poor people, not only to food, but also importance of income support and wage supports, and then especially also with the aim to keep stability in the country, because I think that is a very important issue at the moment. We've seen that countries become unstable, it will be difficult. And then at the end, I think you gave a very good example, and I hope can discuss that also with other countries, how you fitted in those emergency measures with the long-term sustainable development, because sustainable development is not only looking at the coming 2-3 years, but at 2030 and further on. So I think it's welcome. I hope that the presenters, that the organizers will make your slides available, because they're very interested and can be used for various sources. I give now the floor to Mrs. Megumi Mutu. In the meantime, we're waiting for Mr. Mohammed Kanoun, but Mrs. Megumi Mutu, you have the floor. Please go ahead. I don't get any reaction from Mrs. Mutu. Can the technical secretariat advise me whether Mrs. Mutu is available and whether she has maybe technical connections?
Rolf, I can see her in the panelists. Please call on her, and she tested before.
Okay. I think then we should go to Stefan, perhaps. I don't know. Can I ask Stefan whether he's ready to give a statement, and then we'll wait for the Mrs. Mutu and Mrs. Cannon to join us. Stefan de Verre, are you
Yes, I am, Chair. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Stefan. I don't think anybody in the world of social protection needs to have an introduction of Stefan Devereaux, long-time associate with the Institute of Development Studies and well-known. So we like to hear what you are bringing us today. You have the floor, Stefan, for 7 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you for this opportunity to address the Commission. In my remarks today, I want to focus on social protection responses to COVID-19 by member states. And I will draw on work that I'm doing on a COVID-19 recovery framework for Africa, for the African Union, as one member of a large team led by UNDP, but also including UNDRR, WHO, FAO, and other agencies. I want to argue that we learned 3 important lessons from the social response to COVID-19. Firstly, the immense value of having comprehensive and well-functioning social protection programs in place was fully demonstrated during the pandemic, in the sense that these programs could be effectively mobilized in such countries to deliver short-term relief to populations whose livelihoods were temporarily compromised.
Could you speak a bit slower? I think that would be better for the translation, then your good message will be observed by everybody. Thank you.
Okay. So I was saying that these programs could be effectively mobilized in countries that had comprehensive programs to deliver short-term relief to populations whose livelihoods were temporarily compromised by lockdowns that prevented millions of people from earning a living for several months. So these shock-responsive modalities included vertical expansion, meaning that existing beneficiaries of social protection programs received higher benefits for the duration of lockdowns, and also horizontal expansion, meaning that additional beneficiaries were registered temporarily on existing social protection programs. I think the Chair already made this point earlier. On the other hand, countries with limited social protection programs in place struggled to mobilize an effective rapid response. Many low-income countries depended on assistance from the international community, including United Nations agencies, as a kind of stopgap humanitarian relief. A second lesson that we learned is the importance of having efficient systems in place for managing social protection programs, especially platforms for identifying, registering, and making payments to beneficiaries. In this regard, digitalized mechanisms such as computer-based beneficiary registries and mobile money payment systems proved more effective than manual mechanisms that require face-to-face interactions between government officials and members of the public, especially under the rigid restrictions on mobility that were imposed during the pandemic when most government offices were closed and people were confined to their homes. The third important lesson is that COVID-19 exposed huge gaps in social protection provision across the world, even in high-income countries with well-developed and relatively generous programs. The most significant gap is in terms of coverage. In most countries, vulnerable groups such as children, older persons, and persons with disability are usually reached with social assistance in the form of cash transfers or social grants. Working age populations are often covered by social insurance, but only if they have contract employment and are making contributions to social security funds that address contingencies, such as unemployment insurance or pensions after retirement. On the other hand, informal workers, self-employed workers, and employees of small, medium, and micro enterprises have limited or no access to social insurance, and they are not eligible for social assistance. So there is a missing middle in most social protection systems, which was exposed by COVID-19 because this is precisely the group that was worst affected by lockdowns that prevented them from working and earning income. So what are the implications of these lessons for getting back on track towards full implementation of the 2030 Agenda? Clearly, social protection has a central role to play in achieving many of the SDGs, notably those concerned with reducing poverty, hunger, and inequality, but also in ensuring that no one is left behind. In the work that we are doing on the COVID-19 Recovery Framework for Africa, we identify a set of immediate or short-term priorities for social protection, as well as a number of longer-term priorities. Our high-level recommendations include the following. In the short to medium term, we recommend expanding the coverage of social protection programs, especially to include informal workers and other excluded groups. We recommend increasing the benefits paid by social assistance programs and ensuring that payments are index linked to annual inflation rates. And we recommend enhancing the shock responsiveness of social protection systems, for example, by harmonizing social assistance and humanitarian relief interventions, with the goal of ultimately achieving universal coverage of all poor and vulnerable populations. In the medium to long term, we recommend strengthening national social protection systems by firstly moving towards a rights-based approach, by passing legislation that establishes eligibility criteria and accountability mechanisms in law. Secondly, transitioning towards the digitalization of processes such as computer-based registration and management of beneficiaries, as well as mobile money payments where technology allows. And thirdly, establishing efficient institutions that deliver social assistance and social insurance benefits in full, on time, and with dignity to all eligible citizens and residents. To conclude, if the lessons from COVID-19 are taken on board and internalized in policies adopted by governments and supported by the international community, the unprecedented shock created by the pandemic could be seen instead as a valuable wake-up call for additional investments in social protection that will ultimately contribute to achieving the effective implementation of the 2030 Agenda in full and on time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stephen, for this very concise statement. I think I wanted to make a short summary of what you're saying, but you were so concise that everything you said is more or less a summary of longer things. I think what you mentioned came also through in other people's intervention, especially that systems should now be prepared for pandemic, which the system was not most systems were not, and that it is also important to build that in future social security systems, and also that you indicated how the different parts of the social security system target for different socioeconomic groups, and that's where we, I think, have seen also among others who use studies that there's still a lot of lacking, that emergency measures often will not build up a productive base for the people who are affected, and that if you don't build up that productive base, then we will have very much difficulties in achieving the sustainable development goals. I'm looking now at my secretariat again, because we are still missing two speakers, Mr. Kanoun and Mrs. Muto. So I suggest, very good. Thank you very much for being here. I don't know what time it is in your country, so you must probably be somewhere completely out time. So very good that you could join us, and please, you have the floor. Welcome, and I'm very glad we have you on board. Thank you. You have the floor.
Thank you. Is my voice through?
Your voice is perfect. It's probably 6,000 miles or 10,000 miles away.
Muchísimas gracias. Está muy bien. Yeah, I wanted to continue in Spanish, but I will switch to English.
Yeah.
Distinguished audience, I'm a development practitioner representing Japan's aid agency, JICA, which combines technical and financial assistances for the 2030 Agenda. The pandemic threatened lives and the health of people, causing unprecedented socioeconomic downturns around the globe. Under the vision of human security, JICA's efforts center on resilience, building back societies better so that all people can live with dignity. My central message today is that capacities, systems, and policies to deliver are important prerequisites for finance. That's my point, during and in the recovery from the pandemic. I will share with you some specific initiatives that we have been working on. I first mentioned JICA's initiative for global health and medicine as a successful case. Secondly, I mentioned our nutrition declaration showing an area that we could do better. And lastly, I touch upon the collaboration between the private sector on impact financing potential. In June 2020, we launched the Initiative for Global Health and Medicine. We started by reinvigorating our existing capacity building with partner countries such as Ghana, Kenya, Vietnam, and then widening their scopes to strengthen the health systems of other partners under the banner of universal health coverage, leaving no one behind. The three pillars were prevention, precaution, and treatment, covering more than 100 hospitals globally. But we did not stop there. We have extended COVID-19 crisis response emergency support loans for the advancement of social protection, economic recovery, and financial stability. In many cases, coordinating policies and co-financing with the MDBs. The cumulative amount has reached $33 billion US, putting us as the top bilateral financier in the pandemic response. These were possible because capacities in the partner countries were strong and the key response systems and policies were well identified. But then how to support nutrition on the way out of the pandemic is our next challenge. As a consequence of COVID-19, 1 in every 10 people in the developing world are malnourished. At the same time, fiscal space available is very narrow. Last December, at the Tokyo Nutrition for Growth Summit, JICA announced the Nutrition Declaration, commitment to realize human security. It emphasizes the importance of multi-sectoral approach and collaboration with partners. In Africa, we have a dedicated initiative called Initiative for Food and Nutrition Security in Africa. Our new challenge here is this multi-sectoral value chain and KPIs. During the initial responses to the pandemic, we tended to sector-specific, partly because we maximized the use of existing projects and programs. In education, for example, JICA extended support to minimize loss of learning opportunities using TV, radio, non-conventional learning materials. In agriculture, our activities range from research on the COVID impact in each locality to nutrition and food assistance to the most vulnerable. But from now on, we have to focus better on the target beneficiaries like small farmers and think of the most effective set of multi-sectoral support. I have done micro-level household analysis in Asia and Africa and have seen that nutrition and then human capital accumulation are results of supports from different fronts, and above all, the will to invest for a better future. JICA will continue the challenge for a more effective multi-sectoral value chain to enhance collective impact. And finally, for the private sector, they are leading the ESG and impact investment fronts. The ecosystem mobilizing private financing for development is growing fast. JICA has committed to mobilize $15 billion US as part of the G7 2X challenge, which is financing for women. We have invested together with the private financiers in Mexico, Georgia, India, and others to support women-owned businesses. In 19 African countries, we hosted pitch events to match startups and the private sector. The competition called Next Innovation with JICA, Ninja, covered business ideas in the areas of medicine, agriculture, logistics, finance, all strongly digital. For sustainability, we have launched JICA Clean Cities initiative to promote sustainable livable cities partnering with the private sector. So when businesses, ideas, and capacities are there to deliver impact, the investors will join. Ladies and gentlemen, in the response to the COVID-19, public debt is increasing and fiscal space is narrowing. Financing for development, as set forward by the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, is more important than ever. Bottom line, capacities, systems, and policies are keys for the scale-up for financing, not the other way around. We need collective action for maximum impact, not an array of activities for different objectives. And private sector is a strong ally in reversing the momentum. These are lessons for developed countries as well. Japan, for example, is revisiting the division of roles between central and local governments for more agile and effective crisis response and recovery, learning from experiences from all over the world. We believe that with such concerted efforts, we feel we will free people from hunger, poverty, rebuild social stabilities and trust, consolidate fundamental values such as human rights and democracy. The World Social Summit proposed by the Secretary General will be a great opportunity to solidify the course of our joint efforts. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Muto. It's very good to hear from Japan that you have spent your time of interventions on elaborating on the international system, how especially the poorest countries and the poor in poorer countries can be supported through international measures. And I think we can all look and learn from your experience how an industrialized countries can very well manage to help to make systems of social security systems in poorer countries more robust. I also appreciate that you made reference to the Addis Ababa agenda, which was laid at the bottom actually of the Sustainable Development Goals, because if there's no international finance, the international goals and the goals will not be reached. So I thank you very much also for us reminding that. With these interventions, we have finished the interventions of the panelists. I'm just looking at my panelists if one or the other panelist wants to react to what the other panelist has been saying. I'm just quickly looking around if any of the panelists want to react now, to make some comments or share experience. And I don't see any hands asking for the floor for this slot. So I will now go to the speakers list as I have received these from the Secretariat. And I first call on Mr. Stefano Guerra from Portugal. Mr. Stefano Guerra, you have the floor. The chair of this session indicated to us that it's advisable to speak for about 3 minutes. I will also indicate you when that is going over the time limit. But please, you have the floor, Mr. Stefano Guerra from Portugal.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. I will be within the time limit. Allow me to congratulate the panelists for their presentations and for sharing their national policies. In my own country, Portugal, we submitted a recovery and resilience plan in the context of the European Union. The plan contains a set of measures to target poverty and social exclusion in the most disadvantaged municipalities, for example, of the metropolitan areas of Lisbon and Porto. These interventions will focus on 2 ranges. The first, intervention in social infrastructures, such as kindergartens and primary schools, health and care facilities, for social and cultural events. And second, interventions to promote social cohesion, actively involving the communities in their design and implementation, promoting entrepreneurship of small, locally based businesses, designing projects to combat school failure and dropout, offering vocational training and promoting sports. These interventions will help us to fulfill the realization of the SDGs. Now, turning to the question, according to your experiences, what are the main challenges that countries will have to face to get back on track towards the full implementation of the 2030 Agenda? And I thank you. Mr. Moderator, I think we cannot hear you.
Thank you. You have been an excellent assistant moderator to that. Thank you very much. I think that is the most heard phrase in Zoom meetings these days. So I thank you for your intervention and also for indicating how in Portugal you link also the aid and the support in the social security field towards the SDGs. And I think Portugal has come out quite well in that respect, given the latest statistics. I now like to give the floor to Stefania Balz on the Italian youth delegate from Italy. Mrs. Stefania, you have the floor.
Thank you. Ms. Chair, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, we are all aware that we have less than 10 years left to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, and that the COVID-19 has disrupted efforts to perform many of the goals, particularly those focused on ending hunger and poverty. The number of people at risk of starvation is doubled, exacerbating those who are already suffer from poverty, armed conflict, and the climate crisis. All the member states are called to implement long-term policies to achieve the SDGs, reduce poverty, hunger, and inequalities. Accordingly, we must implement multidimensional analytical tools and long-term, risk-informed, and prevention-oriented recovery plans. In addition, we are all aware that effective policies require effective partnerships, and the international community must collaborate to bring together governments, the private sector, civil society, and the science community. But most of all, we believe that the role of young people needs to be enhanced to positively contribute to SDGs achievement. It is well known that young women and men are already contributing substantially towards the SDG, but some still can't play their cards due to critical conditions. Young people help deliver responsibly and attune to real needs and often benefit the economy, efficiency, effectiveness, and sustainability. Moreover, young people can create partnerships, network, and build alliances, both within and between generations. There are many examples of young men and women making a difference. In Italy, the number of enterprises related to SDGs achievement are increasing, from climate change to clean energy, from urban requalification to environmental protection. Can you imagine a future where all young people exploit their potential and contribute to solving global issues? We believe that all the member states need to enhance their commitment to provide young women and men all the tools they need to play their roles. So I would like to ask which policies should be implemented to reach this goal. Together, we will leave no one behind. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephanie Solt. Yeah, Solt is not an Italian name, but Bolt it is. Bait, sorry.
Right,
I
yes.
have very little messages from my secretariat.
Thank you.
Important that you indicate the plight of young people, because studies and also the secretariat in the background paper has very much shown how much these measures to deal with COVID has affected young people, either in their schooling, in trying to get to work, not being fully integrated in the labor market. The depression of young people has shot up during the pandemic. And I think you do right to ask how our country is dealing with that and how can social protection system better take that into account. And I think the members of the Commission will certainly look at that. I now give the floor to another youth delegate to the UN, namely of Switzerland, Yasamine Amorin Sinili.
Merci beaucoup. Madame la Présidente, Mesdames et Messieurs, durant ces 2 ans de pandémie, nous avons tous...
Gentlemen, during these 2 years of the pandemic, we have all personally felt the impact of COVID-19 on the various areas of our life, society, and our lives, of course. Through high degree of digitalization, the world has been able to transition to distance learning when schools were closed, and many people were able to undergo their education in digital format, including in educations of higher learning. Thanks to this, we saw a real opportunity, but we should not forget that there is still a third of the global population that does not have internet access. Moreover, this digitalization has had a big impact on mental health, especially among young people, because they ended up being cut off from part of their youth, and they were able to see others only virtually, their friends, their colleagues, their instructors. The digital world poses numerous threats: harassment, theft, social media harassment. Everyone, but especially young people and minors, are not always sufficiently informed and aware of the dangers that one can face on various social media platforms. This is why it's important for everyone to undergo training, to learn about some of the risks and advantages of using the web. The pandemic has also impacted youth access to employment. In 2020, unemployment rates for 2024 went from 6% to 8%, and in 2021, this age bracket also saw the largest increase in unemployment among all age groups. This is a complicated situation, and that is why we have set up a task force bringing together the Confederation, our cantons, and social partners. It was established between May and November 2020 to help young people undergo professional training. I'd also like to highlight that throughout the pandemic, young people have expressed solidarity, not just among themselves, but also with those who are older. Vulnerable populations have been supported by young people, and we need to recognize their resilience, their commitment by involving them actively in the life of society and by better involving them in political decision-making processes that affect all of us. Intergenerational collaboration is a way for us to move forward. It's a way for us to engage in discussion and find solutions. Listening to young people also means that we have a better chance of saving the planet. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Again, like your colleague from Italy, you also mentioned the importance of youth and also the plight of youth. And I was glad to learn that in Switzerland you're setting up now groups, task forces, social partners, government, youth organizations to deal with that, because I think this is dealing with this is very important for the future, not only social situation, but also economic situation. If youth are not tagged very well to the labor market, fall out, are depressed, cannot function as they ought to function, that will give great problems. And I must also say I live in Switzerland and I've seen indeed how solidarity among young people is very big, and I profited myself from it, to give an example. So thank you very much, and I'm sure that the members of the panel will come back to that, to your statement. I am now looking at the list and call on Agnata Wozniak from the DG Employment of the European Commission. Mrs. Wozniak, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. The European Union Treaty states that our union shall aim at full employment and social progress. In the EU, economic as well as environmental considerations and social rights are components of highly competitive and sustainable development. The main EU policy framework to address poverty is the European Pillar of Social Rights, proclaimed by the European Parliament, the Council, and the European Commission in 2017. It contains ambitious principles and rights essential for fair and well-functioning labor markets and welfare systems, and represents a compass for upward social convergence in the EU. Last year, with the European Pillar of Social Rights Action Plan, the EU and its member states committed to reduce the number of people at risk of poverty or social exclusion in the EU by at least 15 million by 2030, out of which at least 5 million should be children. We also have Team Europe initiatives, which are designed to maximize the impact of the EU and its member states in supporting the development objectives of our partner countries. This includes initiatives which target inequalities in line with country contexts and priorities. I would like to ask the panelists In particular, in your opinion, what population groups should be targeted by specific national policies and messages and measures to combat hunger and poverty? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for these pertinent questions. You posed some clear questions to the panel. How should we target? Because with limited resources, it's always important to target. You can of course say that we look at everybody, but targeting is important and also a political process. So I'd like to hear later on from the panelists how they have reacted to this thorny issue of targeting. I have now on my speakers list José Roman Rodriguez, of the National Council of the Disabled from the Dominican, I'm sorry for that, Dominican Republic. Mr. Rodriguez, you have the floor.
The Dominican Republic has not at all stayed its efforts in combating hunger and poverty during the COVID-19 pandemic. The Ministry of Agriculture drove forward policies to provide responses to the various challenges of the pandemic, aiming at the eradication of poverty. To date, our markets are supplied, and the threat of hunger on our countries is one that we are acting on. Initiatives to staunch the pandemic, providing food, have increased, become more widespread and more effective. We wish to ensure lasting sustainability, giving priority to agriculture on family farms. And we're looking at increasing post-harvest value. And we want to arrive at 0 kilometer supply so that all members of families can create opportunities for sectors for the disabled. The government and the president, Luis Gonapaloma, has a program of zero hunger, providing subsidies, credits, and implementing the digital system that enables indication of production so that it's possible to gain real-time information about crops, demand, and follow-up, and take preventive action where necessary. Sustainable, dependable agriculture is necessary in order to move to eradicating poverty and ensure food sustainability. This is indeed a government policy. We believe that it is a right for the Dominican Republic. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rodriguez. You raised and mentioned the group which until now has not been mentioned yet in our panel discussion, that of the disabled. And I think it's very important indeed to look especially at that group, because the constraining measures of transport and non-connectivity during COVID lockdowns, of course, must have affected very much disabled people. So, and linking then the support of the disabled to increase the capacity in the households and the small enterprises where they're working, I think is very important. And I hope that the panelists will take notice of your remarks, and also in their reactions will indicate how the social security programs can be better targeted to groups like the disabled, who are very much affected to the special measures of lockdown and closure of factories and economic activities. Thank you very much. I now give the floor to Mr. Bermaras, the first secretary of Cuba. I presume the Cuba mission in New York. Mr. Bermaras, you have the floor.
Muchas gracias, señor moderador. Siendo la primera vez que mi delegación toma la palabra en el curso de esta sesión, yo quisiera...
Occasion on which my delegation is taking the floor in this session, I should like to commence by expressing my thanks to Argentina, heading the Commission for Social Development in its session in New York here. This has enabled us to simplify to some extent the complexity of the difficult negotiations in these areas. I should also like to thank the panelists for their excellent presentations. Sir, for my delegation, the pandemic has shown how important the role of states is when it comes to providing welfare for their citizens, and also the need to look at all areas of social development, including the eradication of poverty and combating hunger. Cuba has not been spared by the pandemic. The government adopted a series of measures aimed specifically at fostering food security amongst our people. We are looking at the production of food, subsidies, donations of goods, and ensuring that food is available at accessible prices. There are various other measures that were taken looking at taxes, wages, and social support so that nobody remained uncared for during the difficult times of the pandemic. The government has also been able to start up production, and we have also 3 vaccines. We have our own vaccines. We've got 34 million samples. We have 9 million people vaccinated. We believe also that the increase we've done this despite the US blockade, social and economic embargo implemented by the US, which has affected our country's ability to ensure food security and combat poverty and hunger. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bermaras. I think one point I want to lift out is how Cuba so quickly was able to produce vaccines themselves, thereby showing its resilience in this unstable world and putting priorities where priorities are. And I think maybe that is also a discussion we could have in the panel. What to do about local production of vaccines and how sometimes maybe the international system, the intellectual property rights are hampering countries to produce their own vaccine. So I think you raised an important question. I now give the floor to Maureen Magira from Sober Optimist International. Mrs. Maguire, you have the floor.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you for your excellent presentations. It is encouraging to hear how countries are recovering from the pandemic and the mechanisms that have been put in place and may be put in place to seek to eradicate poverty and hunger in all its forms. Sober Optimist International is aware that food security in particular is an increasing challenge for women and girls, and this was made more so during the pandemic. Women have been on the front line of fighting COVID-19, and their knowledge and skills have been relied on to keep communities and economies afloat whilst facing many compounding factors of multidimensional poverty, unemployment, rising prices, and barriers to education and training. As countries attempt to build forward better, the world has a unique opportunity to restructure, to ensure COVID-19 impacts are not long-lasting. Women and girls must be at the heart of sustainable policies and actions. It is vital that states invest in education and training, ensure universal access to digital technologies, and strengthen social protection systems. Women and girls must be full, equal, effective, and meaningful partners to regain progress towards the 2030 Agenda. My question to the panel is, could they explain how we may work globally to restructure education so that women's unique knowledge is valued and used to create sustainable food systems for all people? Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very concrete question. I normally repeat something what the speakers are saying, but it's so short that I think the panelists have all understood what you were asking on the role of education for women and food systems. So it's something they will take certainly wisdom when they reacting in the second round of our presentations. I now give the floor to Ms. Pierrette Cazot from Haiti. You have the floor.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, ambassadors, your excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Pierrette J. Cazot, and I am the president and founder of Haiti Kaloa Research Foundation, USA. Latino has contributed to the nation economic for many generations, yet historically, are more likely than the general population to experience food insecurity. COVID-related stressors has been exaggerating the situation. Prior to COVID-19, 17% of Hispanic children live in a food insecure household compared to 10.7% of non-Hispanic white children. Since the pandemic began, an estimated 47% of Hispanic households with children have reported food insecurity, which represents the highest percentage reported for all racial and ethnic groups. The pandemic has also led to a rise in Latino unemployment from 4% before COVID-19 to a spike of 18.9% in April 2020, and most recently to 8.8% in October 20. Nearly 3 out of 5 Hispanic households report a loss of income since the pandemic started. With a 1.5 million people in Palm Beach County, Florida, 23% of Hispanic, totaling 350,000, and from this 170,000 are classified as living at the poverty level. Another serious challenge is the increasingly common problem of multiple families inhabiting mobile homes. Living in such close quarters create a favorable environment for spreading disease, mental health, and sexual abuse, including rape. The question is, what are the steps and actions the United Nations will take in order to eliminate hunger and poverty among low-income Hispanic migrants in the United States and around the globe? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Cazot, for this important statement on the plight of the people in Haiti who are still suffering a lot, not only with COVID, because of the aftermath of all the other disasters they have been facing. And I think it's important to keep special attention for certain countries who are in such situation. I would like to thank all the people who have spoken. And I will now go back to the second round of our panel. And I would like
if I may, there just came in one more inscription.
Oh,
just
I haven't
now.
seen it yet.
Just right now.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. It is Mr. Guwu Yorkun from the Chinese mission in New York. Of course, an important voice in the international debate. And we would like very much to hear from you, Mr. Yorkun Guo. You have the floor.
谢谢主持人。主持人，我的发言主要是
Moderator, I would like to focus on digital gap. Digital technology has played a very important role for China to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. 5G temperature measurement and artificial care has done a lot to reduce the risk for the medical care people.
远程视频的会诊也让顶尖的医疗专家可以
Remote diagnosis made the experts do a lot of things to break away from the space limitation.
线上教育等等这些新业态也有效维持了
The remote office work and the cloud economy and online education, these are the new norms of business. They have helped to make our society and economy going on, and this has reduced the economic
从中国
shocks.
的发展经验来看，数字技术
In terms of the development experience in China, digital technology has also provided a lot of support to eradicate
农村的
poverty.
网民规模
At
已经
present,
达到了3亿人。
there's 300 million people in rural areas that are having access to internet.
全国有800多个贫困县实现了电子商务
We
的赋
have over 800 poverty counties. They have all had digital business
互
or
联网
electronic
接入
business.
率达到了98%。
The fiber connection to the rural areas has covered 98%.
大山深处的土特产现在已经变成了网红的产品。
The
中国
special products in the remote and mountainous areas have become very popular.
在过去的5年当中扩大了8倍。
In the past 5 years, this has expanded by over 8 times. Millions of people have been alleviated from poverty and becoming relatively well off.
但是从全球范围看，疫情呢也暴
From
露
the
出
global
数字
perspective,
沟进入的
the pandemic has also exposed the fact that the digital gap is
当
actually
前发达国
expanding.
家
At present, the developed countries, in the developed countries, 87% of the people use
而最
internet.
不发达国家仅有
But
19%。
for the least developed countries, there's only 19% of people using internet.
所以在数字时代，不让任何人
So
掉队
in the digital
也意味着
times,
不让
not
任何
leaving
人掉
anyone
线。
behind, that means nobody should be offline.
我想请教几位
I
专
would
家
like to ask the
确保
panelists,
发展
how
中
do
国家
we
在数字
ensure
能够建设
that
高效、
developing
安全、
countries
可负担的信息通讯基础设施，
can have access to
互联
highly efficient,
互联
secure,
互
and
通
affordable
和数字的可及性。
ICTs, and increase the interconnectivity of internet as well as the digital accessibility?
谢谢主持人。
I thank you, moderator.
Thank you very much, Delegate from China. I think it's indeed important that you indicate about digital opportunities, but also digital divides. And as we have seen in the COVID period, also when people are locked at home, have no contact, digital access is very important. And we see that also in the meetings we have here. So I think the panelists will have certainly something to say for that. The list of speakers is on my list empty. If somebody wants still to make an intervention, please mention that to the Secretariat, but I'd like now to go back to the second part of our panel. We have had a number of very interesting remarks from the floor. I just recall a few of them. In Portugal, delegate asked and indicated also how to link the emergency measures which they took in Portugal with the SDGs, with sustainable development. And I think you all probably have an opinion on that. Then we got two very passionate but very interesting observations from youth delegates from Italy and Switzerland, asking special attention for young people, first of all, for the opportunities they could have, but also to deal with the special problems as youth have during the pandemic, and especially also the economic measures taken after the pandemic, and how can we avoid a lost generation? Because from labor market analysis, it is always known that if you have a recession or young people are locked out of the labor market for a couple of years, their lifetime earnings will be lower than people who are continuous in the labor market. So I think that is also something we really should take into account. And then in discussion of the European Union, which asked, for example, also, and also gave some examples, how to target during a pandemic. Do we just continue with the normal social security system, or do we build in special programs so that we have to target people? Also, I think one of the questions imported, the Dominican Republic pointed to the attention of the plight of disabled workers, and also how can we deal with disabled workers, but not only as giving them a sense of that they target, but also how can they become productive. And Cuba mentioned also the activities they take, and also the international negotiations. And we also heard from the NGOs from So For Optimistic and from Haiti how to deal with special people. And then China, just lately we heard them on international measures in order to follow the digital divide. So we go now back to our original speakers list, and I like to ask Mrs. Marisol Merkel.
Moderator Rolf,
yeah.
May I interrupt? The chair would like to say something before you hand back to the panelists, please.
Of course, that's fine. I thought the chair would do that in the end, but please go ahead, Ambassador.
Moderator, and as chair, I would just like to ask if I could just say something regarding the questions. Minister Jose Roman Ramirez of the Dominican Republic referred to social security and agriculture, sustainable and resilient agriculture. This is a vital issue when it comes to mitigating the problems of hunger and food insecurity. And our colleague from Cuba mentioned something that we cannot leave aside: the issue of the embargo in the light of the very complex international context today. Given the COVID-19 pandemic, the blockade, the embargo on Cuba has been proven to be more inhuman and unfair than ever, with the effects on the health and welfare of Cuban citizens. This country made a major effort to vaccinate its people with its own vaccines. In the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, we must avoid any worsening of the economic crisis and protect those who are most vulnerable, not just those in Cuba, but in all countries where there are low income levels, because there we see the most acute problems deriving from the pandemic. Thank you very much, Mr. Coordinator. And I think it would be excellent if we can hear from Madam Merkel and the other members of the panel who are extremely keen to respond to the questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. That was my whole attention, to give lots of time now to reflect on all those important questions, and also the very political questions you raised at the end. So, Ms. Merkel, there you are. Go ahead. I think you're still on.
Can you hear me? Yes. Fine. I think it is extremely interesting to have had each of the questions and all the contributions coming together, looking at local issues, federal action, global contributions. In Argentina, I think to some extent here we have responses to the various questions in various countries. In 2021, in our National Congress in Argentina, a law was adopted to deal with the social and economic emergency of the pandemic, providing special allocations. This is a law which is an emergency measure with citizens, men and women, who have assets of 200 million or less. Just this group of citizens had to pay a particular percentage so that we could deal with the various areas in our country, 20% for medical equipment. We obviously were thinking on health. 20% of allocations went to SMEs and micro undertakings as well. And then we also provided a program for secondary school and university students to provide more just and equal access in order to try to strike a balance amongst all. We also had an integration fund of structural nature to help with housing, to help those who are suffering most acutely from a lack of basic necessities. We also had the Energy Secretariat of our country endeavoring to support our communities. In our National Congress, we are continuing to talk of our agenda for inclusion with collective participatory work amongst all our national and international bodies. We wish also to look at the issue of social protection, to develop that. The government of Alberto Fernandez has a national ministry for women, gender and diversity with an array of policies and tools to flank social protection for women. This has proved very important regarding women's rights and enriching other areas and helping indeed all the other organisms at work. We have a very strong policies. We have a universal law which has been in force for several years to help women in a vulnerable situation. We have food cards to help those most in need. And all of these measures have been consolidated and increased with state coordination. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Merkel. Very good that you were able to indicate some key programs of the government in Argentina, and other countries can learn from that also and discuss with you how to take all these issues further. I now like to give the floor to Mr. Craney, Ambassador and Vice Director of the Federal Social Insurance Office in Switzerland. You have the floor, sir.
Oui, merci beaucoup. Il y a une question qui a été posée concernant les groupes de population.
Very much. I wanted to comment on the population groups that should be targeted by anti-poverty and anti-hunger measures. I will focus on poverty. I think I have already said it in my presentation, but we have to consider population groups that are living in poverty and are threatened by poverty. This is key. Now, I talked about single parent households, people who are unable to find work. And there's also the risk of losing one's job, potential health problems, loss of housing that can affect these people. And I think that these are the groups that we should really consider. Self-employed people, people with a fixed term contract, part-time employees, people working in small businesses. What should we do? Well, of course, we have to take preventive measures to target vulnerable populations, to prevent them from becoming poor by taking various measures, and also by providing sufficient social protections. As we have seen throughout the COVID crisis, we need money. We need to have a minimum amount of funds that we are using to help these vulnerable groups. We need to provide them with services, for example, financial support for women. We need to provide support in the case of illness, loss of job, if people lose their jobs during the pandemic, during a crisis. We need to provide support to people with disabilities. We mentioned people with disabilities, those working part-time who have much fewer protections than people working full-time, and these are often women. So perhaps it's obvious that we have to talk about social protections, social measures. Not all of our governments have the same means at their disposal, but I think that we need to remember to provide the necessary funds, invest the necessary funds in fighting economic woes, but also in fighting poverty. Good measures also help prevent poverty. And that is what I wanted to say. Thank you.
I now like to give the floor to Mrs. Muto. Your reactions, please. Also, how you can integrate the concerns with some of the countries that are the domestic policies in your international policies, which are so well elucidated from this course of Japan. Thank you. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I think I will first touch upon this question from our Portuguese colleague with regard to the most pressing issue in the full recovery to the SDGs. I have mentioned in my intervention that we have supported many countries through like emergency recovery loans. And through that process, we have been conducting a lot of policy discussions with regard to universal health coverage. And in some countries, we see a lot of emphasis on increasing the domestic resources to really cater for health services for all. For example, tax collection efficiency increase, like in Senegal, Cambodia, and then they are even starting to think about new tax sources, like a new purpose taxes. These are some examples of great efforts for additional fiscal space. And also, I would like to just mention a little bit on the ICT question. In the expansion of the Universal Health Service, not just a diagnostic service that it was mentioned as a case, but also we see a lot of efforts on expanding the health services systems per se by ICTs, by like doing human resource management or like drug supply chain management, all these kind of things. So in response to the ICT question, I think that the more the system, the governance system uses ICT for the better access, I think the role of the technology will increase, and we can create a system in which there will be a great use of the new technologies coming in. And then a little point on the gender issue. In Bhutan, for example, we have seen that they are really advancing policies to protect women and children from gender-related domestic violence. They are really trying to increase the coverage on really taking care of the cases. So we see all these kind of resilient policy responses in all of our partner countries, and I would like to share the positive message. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Mitu, for those encouraging words and to try to integrate all those questions which the participants have raised. I just want to interrupt. I see a hands up from Marisol Merkel. Is that still from a previous intervention, or does she want to come back again on quickly reacting to what Ms. Mutu said? No, I see some hand signs that the hand is there. It's an old hand. It's not a new hand. So we'll take that into account. I now like to call on Stephen Devereaux for his reactions to the questions and the observation based by the other panelists and by the members of the public. Stephen, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, moderator. I'd just like to pick up on 3 questions. The first was the delegate from Portugal who asked, what are the main challenges to get back on track towards Agenda 2030? For me, one of the big challenges that's coming along is the possibility of austerity measures being introduced, which could undermine the gains that we've experienced in terms of social protection being expanded and more inclusive. And I think it's very important that we consolidate the gains in terms of social protection expansion. Don't allow austerity programs to cut back and to exclude people again who've been temporarily included. We should rather try to get them permanently included. And I have one example to draw on, which is in South Africa, a special relief grant was put in place to support working age populations affected by lockdown. And that grant comes to an end at the end of March this year, but there's a campaign underway to convert that into a permanent basic income support for the 18 to 59-year-old population, especially the working poor and the unemployed who aren't covered by social insurance. So I would encourage not to have austerity for these social protection programs, but rather to consolidate and to expand those inclusive programs that were set up during COVID-19. Second point I wanted to make is to respond to the inspiring interventions by the representatives of youth from Italy and Switzerland. And we were asked which policies should be implemented. And I feel that I'm very inspired by the way youth all over Europe and indeed around the world have mobilized recently around the issue of climate change. And I would like to encourage the youth of the world to mobilize also around social protection. You know, if you look at the life cycle, the youth is the one group that's left out of most social protection systems. They're too old to qualify for child benefits and they're not yet working, so they don't yet qualify for social insurance. But they need social insurance, they need social protection. So I would hope that the youth themselves will mobilize strongly around the issues of social protection for themselves and for their fellow citizens and residents. And the third question, which others have already touched on, but I think is a really crucial one, is which population groups should be targeted to combat hunger and poverty in the coming years? And again, I would say the uncovered, unemployed, and the working poor are the most important groups. And that would include, for example, small farmers, and as was mentioned in Haiti and Dominican Republic, but also women seasonal farm workers who are massively underrepresented in social protection systems. And then the representative from Haiti asked specifically about what to do with migrants and their coverage, low-income migrants. And I feel here that there's a very big opportunity to include migrants, but not only migrants, also refugees and internally displaced people in social protection systems. Often they fall between the cracks. They're not eligible for local social protection, but they should be included. So that's a very important step, is to include those people that are permanent, that are residents, either as refugees, migrants, or IDPs, but are not yet covered by social protection. So yes, I think there's great opportunities to expand the gains and get back on track for 2030. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stefan. You were concise, so I won't repeat what you're saying. I just maybe want to lift one point out, which is the first point on the austerity. I think you're very right to indicate that. We have seen that actually when we had the financial crisis in 2009, was for the first time governments took some bold steps of quantitative easing and jacking up demand. But then as soon as there was an inkling of inflation or other economic problems, immediately the mode went back into austerity. And in 2012, we saw immediately already a reaction and a decline in the GDP growth rates and increased poverty again, or not a decline in the poverty anymore. So I think the example of how the economic crisis was handled in 2012 is not a good example. And I think it's indeed very important that we should take great number of measures in order to keep the economy going and not to go to an austerity mode. And maybe that's also an issue which the Commission should really take on board. I know it's a Commission for Social Development, but there's no social development between economic, if there's no economic development, then it's not an equal distribution of the economic development. So maybe with these words, I'd like to give back my moderator position and ask the chair of the Social Commission to react and to close the session. Thank you very much.
Muchísimas gracias a todos los panelistas, a todos los que
My warmest thanks go to all the panelists and all of those who participated, who put questions. A particular word of thanks must go to Mr. van der Hoeven for skillfully guiding this segment of the Commission. Before adjourning, I would like to remind you that the Commission will hold an interactive dialogue with senior officials of the United Nations system on the priority theme this afternoon at 3 p.m. on this platform. We shall have, as we did today, representatives of the FAO, the ILO, and another institution as well will participate this afternoon, and ONGs. The regional commissions, what they say will be extremely important for Latin America and ETLAC. I should like to thank you all very much. So the meeting is adjourned and we shall meet again at 1500 hours, 3 p.m. Thank you very much.